Welcome, my friends, to a new challenge. I know the player through the eyes and mouth. A wonderful and fun challenge for all football fans. Come on, are you ready for the wonderful challenge? Guess who the player is? It is true that he is Szczęsny. Guess who the player is? Yes, Neymar. Guess who the player is? Pau Kubarsi. Guess who the player is? Omar Marmoush. Guess who the player is? Raul Asensio. You are awesome, let's continue. Guess who the player is? Mohamed Salah. Guess who the player is? Marcos Llorente. Guess who the player is? Nicolò Barella. Guess who the player is? Federico Valverde. Guess who the player is? Erling Haaland. Guess who the player is? Jorginho. Guess who the player is? Victor Gyökeres. Guess who the player is? Pervis Estupiñán. Guess who the player is? Malo Gusto. Guess who the player is? Kvaratskhelia. Guess who the player is? João Felix. Guess who the player is? Ronald Araujo. Guess who the player is? Riyad Mahrez. Guess who the player is? Alexis McAllister. Guess who the player is? Chris Wood. Great, come on, continue. Guess who the player is? Pedro Neto. Guess who the player is? Mehdi Taremi. Guess who the player is? Angel Correa. Guess who the player is? Rodrigo Bentancur. Guess who the player is? Rafinha. Guess who the player is? Raheem Sterling. Guess who the player is? Nusser Mazraoui. Guess who the player is? Kylian Mbappé. Guess who the player is? Kenan Yildiz. Guess who the player is? Gonzalo Ramos. Guess who the player is? Ben White. Guess who the player is? Savinho. Guess who the player is? Okafor. Guess who the player is? Kim Min-jae. Guess who the player is? Livramento. Guess who the player is? Marco Reus. Guess who the player is? Cristiano Ronaldo. Guess who the player is? Lionel Messi. Guess who the player is? Eden Hazard. Guess who the player is? Mesut Ozil. You are amazing. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell button to receive all that is new.